Hi, Daniel.
Hello, Daniel.
Hey, hi, Michelle. Alex, how are you?
Thank you so much for joining us.
It's an honor to be with you all. Good morning. It's morning for me, but good afternoon to those on the East Coast. I'm actually out west.
What is behind you? Is it like a trampoline?
Yeah, it's my brother's garage. It's his kid's trampoline, which is yeah, it's like the only quiet place in the house that I could find.
For sure.
Strange background, but perhaps appropriate to talk about the family.
Yeah, sure.
And there will be little kids periodically running through this garage, just as a fair warning. That should be okay.
Mm-hmm.
It is a Sunday after all. Alex, how are you?
I'm okay. I'm all right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the conference next week. It's been kind of hectic over here and getting it set up, but it should be fun. It should be good. I think
I can't wait.
Yeah, it should be all right.
Saturday, right? Saturday afternoon.
So yes. I mean, it runs through the whole weekend, but
Yeah.
I have to they made me chair a bunch of shit and stuff, and which is fine. I mean, it's an honor, but it's a little much. And
I noticed that. That's exciting.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
You have to become familiar with like many books.
Well,
which is good.
Yeah, I'm gonna fake it a little bit. I had to do a panel with a bunch of millenarians who want to do something on ordinary psychosis, and so that one will be particularly strange, I think, but we'll see how it goes.
Millenarians have a real block in New York. They have events sometimes, and they what are they called? NLS, and they have a whole shtick going on. They're really in their own world.
Yes.
I'm definitely scared of them. There was one of them at IFTAR as an advanced candidate who lectured occasionally, and was brilliant and disturbing.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right to me. So we'll see how it goes. I mean, it's having the pretense of being a PhD student, I can just kind of phone it in and or whatever, and I don't have to be like confrontational with them, but it'll be interesting. I mean, the clinical stuff is actually kind of fun. I mean, all the clinical stuff that we're going to do this weekend is kind of interesting. A lot of people in the department and cohort, have cases that they don't quite understand, and it's nice to have some space for that, for sure.
Should we go ahead and let everybody in?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I'll admit all.
Sounds good. Hello, everyone. We'll wait 1 or 2 minutes before we get started, but I want to encourage people to have their cameras on if you're in circumstances that allow for it, since we have such a small audience today that might grow based on RSVPs. And in just, I'd say 2 minutes, I will get going and introduce Daniel.
Oh, I should say, Daniel, Hannah wants to just say, just to send regards to you. She's in London right now, and she has to do dinner and a bunch of other sort of social obligations. So she regrets not being able to be here. Just want to say
no worries. Is she coming to the Duquesne conference as well?
No, she'll be in London the whole time. So
got it.
Yeah. She's having a good time with her family and stuff.
Oh, right on.
Okay, hello everyone. Today we are very excited to have Daniel Tutt. I'll be introducing him in a moment. So we are partway in on the week 2 of part 3 of the seminar. So we've been following the arc of classical psychoanalysis and then revolutionary critiques of the family, and then contemporary psychoanalytic debates of the family. And Daniel Tutt was very generous in being willing to rearrange his schedule at the last minute based on a conflict that Palumi had. So we will hear from Daniel Tutt today, R.A. Judy in 2 weeks, then our own Alex Colston, and then end up closing with Palumi Saha. This is very germane as a book. It engages a number of the readings and material that we've engaged up to this point, very, very, very relevant to the core of the seminar. And Daniel Tutt was very generous in allowing us to share chapters of his book. And he's, as a colleague and a comrade, we're very excited to have him here today. So we are going to follow the program that we shifted to last week, which is to split into small groups, no matter how few people come. So I'll introduce Daniel. He will give a presentation. Depending on how long it is, we might have time for direct questions to Daniel. Then we will split up into small groups that are between 30 and 45 minutes, and I'll announce their duration. And each one of them will have a facilitator. And then after that, we'll come back together as a whole group and have a discussion that might include some direct questions and some debate and whatever else comes up. And Wendy Lauderman is doing tech today. So if you have problems of any sort, you can message her. We're both co-hosts, and Hannah is not able to join us today. Okay, so Daniel Tutt is trained in philosophy and psychoanalytic theory, and his research and writing is concerned with contemporary Marxism, especially the work of Lukács, Alain Badawi, and the resurgence of worldview Marxism. He also studies and writes in psychoanalytic thought. Tutt has been a member of the Lacanian Forum of Washington, D.C. for over 12 years, and he has undergone Lacanian analysis, although he is not a practicing analyst. He completed his PhD dissertation with the Freudian theorist Lawrence Rickles and the French philosopher Alain Badawi at the EGS, or European Graduate School. He has taught philosophy at George Washington University, the Washington, D.C. Jail, and Marymount University. Tutt is a podcaster with 0 books, and he is the founder of study groups on psychoanalysis and politics, an extra academic community that offers affordable seminars and study groups for students and the wider public. Tutt's first book that we're discussing today, Psychoanalysis and the Politics of Family, is concerned with reinterrogating what the psychoanalytic legacy of the Oedipus complex is in today's time. Specifically, how our so-called post-Oedipal society still wrestles with the complicated legacies of Oedipal formations in our everyday life. One of the main objectives of this book is to interrogate what Oedipal theories offer to subjective liberation for today's left. Tutt is currently working on a book under contract with Repeater Books that takes a less common reading of the legacy of Nietzsche's philosophy from the perspective of worldview Marxism, especially the thought of Lukács, Domenico Lusurdo, Jeff Waite, and others lesser-known Marxist critics of Nietzsche, who see in his philosophy a profound challenge to any socialist or universal emancipatory politics. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Tutt.
Wow. Hi, everyone. It's really so delightful to be with you all. And Michelle, thank you for that introduction. And I want to thank Hannah and Alex. We were recently in a panel together and have been exchanging thoughts and debates and ideas around this theme of the family. And this book that I wrote is sort of emerged out of COVID times, but actually has a much bigger prehistory that goes way back into both personal, which we can talk about, the autobiographical elements of this text, which I think are actually important, as any text, whether they're explicit or implicit. Maybe we should make them more explicit. So it comes out of experiences of my own family. It comes out of experiences which are somewhat particular to both class as well as familial authority experiences, which I think are important. And it also comes out of frustrations that I've seen in the post-Lacanian cosmos, world, universe of thinkers around, we might say, the application of the theory of Oedipus to politics. And the interesting thing about the book so far has the conversations that it's brought out and been able to spark. I end the book with a proposition building off of Mark Fisher's interesting late work in Acid Communism, where he says that there's a kind of internal super-egoic battle on the contemporary left between what he calls a kind of joyless ascetic Leninism and a left based on care and based on a kind of, maybe we could say, more horizontal relation to thinking liberation that comes out of socialist feminist thought, broadly speaking, and libertine thought also. And my proposition in the book was that that rift that Fisher identifies is in fact a real rift that needs to be discussed and dialogued and worked through. So that's one objective of the book. I'm someone who has a background in training also in conflict resolution, so I look at the radical left through that lens. I've served as an ombudsman, a mediator between Palestinian and Israeli, Muslim and Jewish conflict. So I feel that sometimes
Is Daniel Tutt frozen for everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if
Am I frozen?
Yes, you're
You're-
back now.
I'm back. Where did you lose me? Sorry. Am I
You
back?
were talking about your role in conflict resolution around
Yes.
Palestine.
Yeah, I bring that focus on conflict resolution to thinking the contemporary left, and in a kind of post-2008 milieu, I think that the repetition of conflicts which we have inherited from the new left, right, still set a certain backdrop to our contemporary situation. And so perhaps my book was an invitation to find a different way to talk about some of those implicit divisions on the left. I don't mean to be Manichean about that division as if it is the primary contradiction or the primary dualism between a kind of libertine, joy-centered theory of liberation versus a kind of, I don't know, more masculinist, more, pro-traditionalist, orientation. So there's something in that divide that the book is wanting to bring out and is wanting to pinpoint. So that's a kind of higher level objective of the book if you read the last two chapters. The other thing I'll say is that the book is concerned with trying to sort of shine a light on what Oedipal subjectivization is about. One proposal that I work with is the idea that Oedipal subjectivization is no longer the universal form of subjectivization, right? And that we are in not necessarily a post-Oedipal social arrangement, but rather it's, as Miller, the Lacanian Miller says, it's a kind of particular form, a particular solution, which is not necessarily imposed. Now, when we point a juncture in which its applicability was more universal, I think the interesting thing that a thinker like Badiou will point out, right, is that universalism was actually afforded by the state and particularly warfare, right? So he actually says something quite important, which is that the bond of the efficacy of the Oedipus relation, especially between father-son relation, was afforded by the draft into the military and the initiation process that afforded. And speaking now as somebody coming at you from a very enclave of probably the most concentrated Republican enclave in Southern California. I was just attending the funeral of my stepmother, and so I apologize. I'm actually quite tired. I've been up all night, but it's evident to me that there is something of a true status of bad Jews wager, that the post-war crisis of Oedipus is also related to some fraying of the state bond and the capacity of the state bond. So I think about it through that lens. I also think about that fraying of the Oedipal bond through what Lacan calls the discourse of the capitalists. And I don't know, Alex or Michelle, if you all have talked about Lacan's theory of the discourses too much, but one of the arguments that Lacan points out there is that you have what he calls a kind of asymbolic form of relationality today, meaning that the efficacy of Oedipal logics, and we can define Oedipal logics very broadly here as a positive process of overcoming paternal dependencies, right? Often the debate emerges around whether that theory is too exclusively focused on the position of the father for that necessary overcoming. So we have here introduced a resurgence, a return to the debate that Hannah variously pointed out in her conversation on Lash and Mitchell last time, which I broach, right? Which is, if we are in some kind of post-Oedipal crisis order, and the Oedipus efficacy has waned, but yet still kind of haunts the social order in some way, can we think that stunting, or to use a concept which I am not committed to, but which has some explanatory use, can we think our current historical conjuncture as pre-Oedipal? And I think here we fall into the weeds of a lot of complex psychoanalytic theory, as well as an ethical problem around theorizing exactly what we mean by pre-Oedipal, right? Because in that sense, let's give a couple ways of reading it. One way to read it would be pre-Oedipality is a kind of deadlock for emancipatory politics, because what it conditions us to is a kind of relation, especially say of wage labor, that is one of a radical dependency, but through an unconscious reliance on an untranscendable set of authorities. So I actually have a chapter where I try to suggest that liberal capitalism foments pre-Oedipality in a certain sense, and that it's possible to theorize a form of Oedipus which would be more adequately capable of overcoming dependencies. Now, this, of course, was a proposal of Horkheimer from Frankfurt School, and I will confess that I'm not fully signed up to his proposition, and I think it is this proposition that introduces a great point for debate and discussion, which is what? Which is that, in fact, at a certain historical point, the bourgeois structure of the family produced a subjectivity which was more capable of overcoming Oedipal dependencies. Something like the thesis, which is you need to have a stable familial experience in order to come out the other side more capable of challenging authority that appears in familial form, but outside of the family, say in the realm of politics, if that makes sense, right? And that is a proposition that I work with. However, we have to recognize with that proposition, it has been taken up in ways which lead to a lot of fomenting of resentment and frustration within the left, precisely because it relies on the theory of the father as a necessary source of liberation, right? And that means that we're opened up into a new way of theorizing. It falls back on us in our contemporary conjecture to actually theorize what that means in some sense. So it actually returns us to the question that Freud opens up in the interpretation of dreams in 1900, which is what is the position of the father at the core of the social bond itself, right? And as we know, as I tried to articulate in the chapter that I think was circulated to you all, Freud relies on a certain theory of the father as stabilizer, right? And that theory of the father as stabilizer is actually an aristocratic stabilizer, right? So it's a very interesting historical reliance that liberal capitalism has on an authoritarian father as a necessary stabilizer to social order, okay? Now, one big question that I try to work with through René Girard and Alain Badiou, who both theorize the same historical crisis of Oedipal subjectivization, right? Which they periodize, and everyone tends to periodize it around the turn towards financial capitalism in the 1970s till now, is around this kind of proliferation of capitalist sociality and the weakening of familial bonds and the concurrent necessity for finding some replacement stabilization mechanism for subjectivization so that subjectivization can actually achieve a more thorough working through of its own dependency, right? So in a way, you could say my theory of Oedipus that I think psychoanalytic theory gives us is sort of a theory of dependency, which I then try to apply to a thinking. I try to argue that, and I get a lot of this from Fred Moten as well, because Fred Moten has this notion that one contribution of the Black radical tradition and of the Black proletariat is that there is a subjective knowledge and strength which comes from being absolutely discarded from, let's say, normative Oedipal forms. So I'm not as interested in thinking about the family, therefore, as a kind of middle class form or a bourgeois form. Or, you know, oftentimes you'll read theorists of the family, and they actually have no theory of the class differentiations in the experiential level of the family. But what Moten and others have alerted me to is the idea that those extinct or cast off from familial subjectivization from this. So there is a kind of universal strain of Oedipus, absolutely. But there's other levels at the same time which allow for a certain more radically socialized alternative form of overcoming Oedipal dependencies. And this is what I call subjects of counter initiation. So I use the concept which is quasi-religious. People have various uneasiness with the notion of initiation because of its mystical baggage and history. But I try to use it in a pretty secular way. I try to basically say that Lacan identifies this crisis of Oedipus and takes the courage of the next step to reinvent, but he never achieves it, reinvent some thinking about what subjectivity is going to experience in a post-Oedipal social arrangement. That's kind of one way to think about Lacan's later teachings, right? Which are both social insights as well as clinical insights, by the way. So I use initiation basically to mean that in Freud's time, Oedipus could be seen as a successful form of initiation, meaning that in general, Oedipus therefore refers to a independence or liberation of the subject's desire, right? In that sense, you could say Oedipus is a more comprehensive transcending of the father's dependency. Again, this goes back to the ethical question of the position of the father, which I definitely want to talk to you all about. I know that Alex and Michelle and others have really sophisticated thoughts about that, which is why I love being with you all. So you see, my question there is, if Oedipus is this theory of socialization in which at certain times in Western capitalist history, subjectivity actually possessed the capacity for a more adequate working through, and therefore the consequence of that would be that left solidarity and lack of rivalrous relations, lateral competition and dependencies were mitigated, then if that proposition is true, right, then perhaps we need to think about ways in which Oedipal subjectivization can be more adequately overcome or processed, etc. If in fact we're in a condition of, let's say, defective Oedipalization, right? And I tried to point out that there are some symptoms of defective Oedipalization, which I try to also link to post-2008 austerity and new forms, even I would say, of, even though many readers of Marx will be frustrated with it, of the neo-feudal thesis, right? Which is that post-2008 capitalism is reintroducing more entrenched forms of wage labor dependency, as well as producing more subjects completely barred from the wage. And so I therefore also try to theorize those subjects through the category of lumpen proletariat. So I have a whole section on how we might think post-Oedipal subjectivity along a new way of thinking about the lumpen proletariat. Those are some points I want to raise with you. I would also say in closing, I don't know how much time I have, Michelle. Could I get a time check by chance?
Finishing up in the next 5 minutes would be great.
Okay, perfect. Let me say a couple of things then on the ethical dimensions of this conversation that we're having, because in Hannah's last talk, we considered the sibling relation and the horizontalism of the sibling relation, which was contrasted to the kind of verticalism of the Oedipal father-son relation. And what I found interesting was that many commentators will say that the old traditional collapse of the vertical father-son Oedipal relation actually produces an untranscendable horizontalism, right? In other words, there's kind of unconscious dependencies even within certain forms of revolt. And this then introduces a frustrating insight, which you see in a thinker like Lasch, who will basically suggest that we can critique the contemporary left as pre-Oedipal. And if they are pre-Oedipal, if that's a kind of dominant form of subjectivity, then they can be also theorized as caught within dependencies for which they have an unconscious. And of course, if you were to say in the rhetorical field of like trying to form solidarity on the left, if you were to accuse someone of that, you're going to immediately bar the possibility of solidarity. It's not a proposition which is going to further the unity that I wanted to produce, which I mentioned at the beginning, that Fisher identified, right? To the contrary. And this was my problem with Lasch. That's one of my problems with Lasch, which is that is the politics that Laschianism gives us, right? And so then he undermines his objective in a sense, right? So, and I've interviewed his daughter. I've gone on a lot of podcasts. I've talked a lot about Lasch. I think that I have a good grasp on the complexity of why he is returning as an extremely polarizing figure. But I've reached the conclusion now that his insights need to be dealt with in like an extremely procedural and ethical way. Otherwise, they backfire and they lead to and they foment the very resentments that he wanted the left to overcome, right? So number one. Number two, I think there's other philosophers of psychoanalysis that can actually open up better ways of managing those same insights that Lasch was trying to work with, right? Lasch was somebody who was working on the outside of the left as a critic of the left, as a kind of former member of the left. And I think when you get to that point, the lessons you're trying to impart to the left are not going to be internalized in any productive way, ultimately. And I think that's one major problem of his. I think another major problem is that he theorizes this 1970s break, this historical break of this post-Oedipal situation in ways which also fomented a lot of rivalry with socialist feminism, in part because he was wanting to say that even though he tried to defend this position against someone like Dinnerstein, who accused him of putting forward a necessary theory of liberation reliant on the father. Yeah? So one of the big questions that I want to reinterrogate is, and I say this as a biographical point, as someone who has been barred from Oedipal overcoming with my father, or to the extent that I had an Oedipal relation to my father, it only resulted in he and I becoming brothers. But there was never a point at which his position in my life could take on this position of what we're told a father must. So you see the point, which is, I'm not sure that there is such a thing as a successful Oedipal overcoming. But nonetheless, Lacan wanted to point out, even in conditions where there's not, we still search for that, which is another insight of Lacan, which kind of drives us crazy a little bit, right? You know what I mean? At the same time, Lacan gives a lot which are going to be less.
You're breaking up a bit there, Daniel. I think you're still frozen, I'm afraid. Okay, Daniel, if you can hear us, it might be good to turn off your camera and mic and turn them back on, maybe even log out and come back in. If you can hear us, I will try to. Oh, okay. So when Daniel comes back in, we'll hear the closing words of his presentation and then take a short amount of time for questions. There he is, and then break into small groups. Okay, Daniel, you're back.
Hi, sorry about that. I don't have great connection. I'm so sorry. I'm in a garage in California. I'm not at home, and I had a death in a family, so I apologize. But emotionally, I feel like I'm okay because it was a very good celebration of her life. So I'm here with you, and I'm very happy to be with you, and very open.
Okay, maybe maybe we should go to small groups,
Yeah.
or are you back, Daniel? Are you there, Daniel?
He's muted.
I'm here now. Better?
Okay, great. Yes. So let's hear the last part of your presentation. There's a comment in the notes. Sorry for your loss, and I think we all are. And then let's break into small groups.
Okay,
Oh,
fabulous.
there you are. Okay.
Hi. Okay. So I guess the final comments I wish to make is, I don't know where you lost me last. Could you remind me where you lost me with the recording or with my connection?
Someone else might need to. I got distracted by the video.
No,
We're talking
you're
about
saying-
Lacan's idea of searching for an edible solution, even if the
Yes.
solution is deadlocked.
yeah. Got it. So I think that one of the things that's interested me quite a lot is psychoanalysis from a clinical standpoint has in part been in a crisis because the universalism of Oedipal subjectivization is now fragmented, right? And as somebody who theorizes this and its implication for politics, what interests me quite a lot is the ways that what psychoanalysis points to as this kind of unconscious yearning for a restoration of subjectivity through the Oedipal process, let's say, can be thought of, I would wager, in ways which do not necessarily have to reproduce the kind of necessary reliance on the patriarchal father or on the Freudian father structure, right? And I try to show through a reading of the Japanese Marxist philosopher Kochin Karatani that his notions there of all of the Freudian categories of thought and the way that he theorizes this 1970s historical break are so robust and precise and non-culture war inducing insights that they really, and I'm referring to his book on Freud and Kant, where he says that one way to understand the crisis of the Oedipal subjectivity is basically through a theory of consumer capitalism and the dominance of subjectivity in those conditions, right? And what he says is basically that the subject suffers from a deficiency of superegoic efficacy, but that superegoic efficacy could be theorized for the left, even for the radical left, as re-emerging in conditions of political uprising, social crises, political crises, etc. And I guess I'm throwing Karatani out there because he's not a natural interlocutor for psychoanalytic thought, but it turns out actually that he is, and I would highly recommend it, in part because it can be quite toxic the way that you theorize this issue, and it requires this ethical attentiveness and sensitivity, which is part of what my book was trying to broach, right? If that makes sense. So anyways, I've said a lot and I'll stop here.
Okay, I think go ahead and go to a 5-minute break now. We will open it up and we're going to start off for at least a few minutes for direct questions to Daniel that people want to ask before we move into more open discussion and all. So any direct questions for Daniel at all that came up for you in the presentation, the reading, or the small groups?
Emmy, it looks like Benjamin Mayer has hand up.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Daniel, are you there with us? I'm not seeing you here.
Hi, I'm here. Can you see me?
Okay, yeah, I see you now. Hey, how you been? Good to see you, by the way.
Yeah, likewise. What's going
Yeah.
on?
I had a question about the idea of the Oedipal deadlocks. I think it's the right one. And by the way, thanks for writing the book. It gives so much to think about. It's really great. But I wonder if there might be a way to think about the Oedipal deadlock in the same kind of a way that Lacan kind of uses the master signifier language to kind of say that something is always sort of left over. It's always sort of too much or too little. And then he talks about the petite a sort of being left over. I wonder if that could be maybe similar to what you're aiming toward here, looking at the Oedipal crisis of initiation.
Thanks so much, Ben. In some sense, yes, although I'm hesitant to adopt the Žižekian position that the predominant relation to the crisis of Oedipus is the perverse subject. Many folks have been talking about the function of disavowal. I think that this crisis is not, I'm very wary of producing I don't know, a statement that the deadlocks of Oedipus produce one primary form. I think that they take myriad forms, and they're always in a kind of dialectical relationality also to material relations of political economy. And I think that Lacanianism, what I try to show is that it doesn't offer as much attention to the political economy dimensions of these oscillations of kind of post-70s crisis of Oedipal formation. So what you're talking about is really, I think, through Lacan's theory of the discourses, right? And I think that there's a lot of value in the mathemes. But what I dislike about Lacan's theory of discourses is they sometimes can be sort of trying to provide a kind of magical answer to the subjective condition of our society. And when in reality, I think that a lot more thinking needs to take place. Also because Lacan's insights at that period of his time are also dated, I feel, in some sense. I'm talking here about the other side of psychoanalysis up to the encore kind of period, which a lot of people got a lot of insight for politics from that period. But that was a period which was still in the kind of Fordist form of capitalism. It was not facing the type of conditions that we have now. So I always feel that some of those insights need to be taken with a grain of salt in a way. So I'm not comfortable to sort of approach this problem through ultra formalization and the math themes, even though I think they're quite valuable. Okay, I'm trying to rather open up a conversation and a kind of point to the landscape, right? Which is why I have many references to many philosophers of psychoanalysis, not only clinical psychoanalysts, right? I'm trying to broaden the field and show that people from Lasch to Lacan to Cogin-Karatani, to a wide range of socialist feminist thinkers and beyond are all pointing to something which is kind of quite similar, right? But they're giving us different ways to resolve it. So I hope that gets close to answering.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I appreciate
Thanks so
it.
much, Ben.
Yeah.
Sure.
Other direct questions? Our group certainly had a number of things that people struggled to understand. So now would be a very good opportunity to put those to the author.
I can try. Hi,
Thank you, Suzanne.
hi, Daniel. Thanks for the presentation and in general your work. Our main confusion was the relationship and the status of the Oedipus complex. I try to summarize my position, not the one of the others, but there was a variation of this theme of not really understanding your position also in terms of, is the Oedipus complex something that needs to be preserved, or is it something that we can overcome? There seems to be definitely in Lasch a nostalgia for it, like you say, but I was wondering also about you, what you seem to emphasize the positive aspect of the Oedipus complex, so the working through the attachment and then distancing from authority figures. But from my perspective, that's a necessary thing a process to engage in a hierarchical society, right? We do have to do that. In a patriarchal society, we are forced to internalize certain figures, and then for liberation, we distance ourselves from them. But to me, the Oedipus complex and even having a superego has always been a marker of a very strict authoritarian society. And then maybe this is my utopic, unrealistic hope that in a different society, a more democratic, more egalitarian society, that we wouldn't need to go through that. And you call it kind of an initiation also. And so I was wondering if, you know, what's your stance on it? Do we need to preserve it, or can we overcome it eventually in a different type of society? And as a member of the group, I had kind of variation on the themes in terms of their confusion.
Yeah, I mean, I oscillate on this, to be quite honest with you, because I think that the question produces a profound symptomatic mirror to this divide that we see on the left, which I articulated in my opening remarks. And I think that Lacan wanted to say something like the Oedipal subjectivization is going to haunt the civilization, even in a society which is undergoing, I don't know, post-patriarchal, etc. I mean, of course, our society is not really doing that at the same time. So this was my wager, was that for me, I guess you could say, Oedipus is something which must be worked through, in that sense, that if it's not worked through, if it is this kind of ultra pragmatist tool for some subjects to choose to resolve their psychical dependencies, we can think about it as something which should be furthered. That doesn't mean that it must be enforced, or that furthering it, like what would it look like to further this form of psychic liberation without reproducing the very problems that Deleuze and Guattari tried to diagnose with Oedipus? And of course, my chapter on Deleuze and Guattari is quite constructive there, in the sense that I felt that much of their project did give way to what many Lacanians will accuse it of a kind of unintentional reproduction of liberal mode of liberation, which Deleuze, I tried to argue, himself recognized as a shortcoming of his project. And I introduced a category which I know Alex and others are perhaps not comfortable with, which is the category of ultra liberalism, right? So this is another ethical question that I sincerely am driven by. Can certain theories of horizontal radical liberation, non-Oedipal liberation, produce a unresolved relation to Oedipus? Does Oedipus still haunt us in some sense? It's an open question for me, Suzanne. I guess my position is that it does, and that we need to think further and with more tools about facing it head on in some ways. Of course, what that looks like politically can be quite catastrophic. As we said in the beginning, before I spoke, take the Malarian school, right? They fully submit to this particular pragmatic vision of Oedipus in their clinic, but their politics are quite liberal authoritarian. They're quite liberal authoritarian, right? So my question is always, how do we circumvent the liberal strangleholds? And it's a big concern of mine in my chapter on liberalism and the Oedipal, where I try to show that Rawlsianism, and I think I take John Rawls, as one of the most important thinkers of civic subjectivity, is somebody who also foments the deadlocks of Oedipus, because his whole model is reliant on untranscendable authorities, right? So those are my thoughts for now, Suzanne. I hope that gets close to the question.
Okay, thanks. Yes, it's a work in progress for me, so I keep thinking about it. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm hesitant to stake down some strong claim on this issue, and I don't think any psychoanalytic theorist really should, in some ways, be so comfortable to do so. Perhaps, if we are reminded of Lacan's point that the Oedipus complex remains this kind of riddle of human life, we should honor that ambiguity of it and work with it, work in the space of that ambiguity of it, and also work in the space of its own inconsistency.
Daniel, I wanted to ask a question from our group. It's not my question, it's Becca's question. But they asked me to ask it, so I'm going to do that. I wanted to say just one thing just on this last point, Daniel, which is that, and I said this in the group too, which is that clinically, and this is hard, it's hard to know how to elaborate this into an analysis of political formations, but clinically, the kind of like rule of thumb or like quip that we always make is that, like, at least in our department, is that if your patient is like extremely hung up on the father and can't quite think beyond its parameters, and by propping it up or trying to destroy it or whatever, then yeah, Oedipus seems like a useful mythos to pay attention to. You don't necessarily want to impose it, but you can think through it that way. So that was my first thought on this sort of haunting aspect of Oedipus. But then Beckett had this great question about Klaus Thedowite's male fantasies. And you said it in your piece and in your presentation that you characterized liberal capitalism as having a pre-Oedipal hangups on some level, as a pre-Oedipal political economy. But what's interesting about the Thedowite is that he also says that the Freikorps and fascist formations are themselves preoccupied with pre-Oedipal complexes and difficulties, right? Their fear, their paranoia, their anxiety, the thing that they're in total war against is fluidity, women, communism, right? The kind of the sort of flushing out of boundaries and of a stable sense of self that they're trying to preserve through going to war. And so I was wondering what you made of this kind of sort of diagnostic overlap, right? If the liberal political economy is also sort of besieged on some level by these pre-Oedipal symptoms, but then also these fascist formations are too. What do you make? How do you make sense of those sort of like that seeming overlap?
Yeah. No, it's beautiful. Part of me is didn't have the space, but I would love to in the future research, follow Adorno's suggestion that there's a link between Nazi fetishization of adolescence and mass traumatization in the nuclear age or pre-nuclear age, but like in the age of post-World War I subjective life. And that could be theorized also as a opening of the problem of pre-Oedipality in the Western civilization, which was then, of course, transferred to California. And my advisor, Lawrence Rickles, has a wonderful text called The Case of California, which looks precisely at the supplanting, and he's done 3 volumes on what he calls Nazi psychoanalysis, which I think is quite a useful supplement to the text you referenced before about male fantasies text, where in a very nice way, he's working with Adorno in Horkheimer's culture industry, but also working on that notion of adolescence as a means for keeping the subject in a state of a constant transference and keeping the subject, therefore, in a state of pre-Oedipality. In other words, a way of fending off the confrontation with Oedipus, ultimately. And so, you can think a fascistic form of state bond through that mode of theorizing. What I think lashes onto with his theory of pre-Oedipalism is different. And I'm not sure that, I think it has some merits, but it has also, he's working on a kind of American Frankfurt style alternative to that, And what's interesting me about what I want to research more is the question of its linkage to traumatization. That is something that interests me. And the other thing that interests me is, and I wonder if you agree, is it a form in which the subjectivity is, I don't know how to say this, like encouraged not to face the Oedipal drama. In other words, it's one in which what's pragmatic about Oedipus is precisely the fact that you can choose not to be subjectivized that way, right? Some can choose, like I think this is a beautiful point with the Herschel Walker drama with his son, right? Which is the moralistic base of Herschel Walker's voters are not probably going to hold him accountable for not being a good Oedipal father, right? Which is another proof that even at the level of conservative ideology, Oedipus does not have a kind of sovereignty in some sense, in a way. You know my point? I wonder if you agree with that. And so I wonder then, yeah, in some sense, what then is left of those subjects who need, what is the causality of those subjects which do feel the necessity to work through it? And what might that mean, as we were talking in our small group, of thinking the commune and the position of, say, the father and so on in that context? Because I also would say that there's a tendency in which we can kind of too quickly shrug off this whole questioning as a line of kind of, oh, it's those who have daddy issues, right? Whereas, so you create a weird sort of contrast, right? Of like those who do and those who don't. And then what's the basis of that? Is it an arbitrary difference? Is the meaning of that? And those are things that come to mind. So I'm hoping that I'm getting close to something helpful there, my friend. It's a great question, though.
Yeah, totally. It's very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
open
because
it up
yeah.
for, oh, sorry,
Go ahead.
go on, Daniel.
No, I was just saying the whole thing of pre-Oedipality is a debate also within, and Alex knows this as well. Lacan would not submit to the notion of pre-Oedipality, I think, for the way that he theorizes the name of the father, by the way. And also, so pre-Oedipality for someone like Lasch, by the way, is a way of thinking about the crisis of how neoliberal capitalism is not giving us clear demarcators of what it means to be an adult, right? So like, it's kind of like a different form of permanent adolescence that we live with today, different from the fascistic form that you mentioned, Alex, right? But still structural, has some resemblance, perhaps.
Mhm.
I want to open it up for any comments, critiques, responses, thoughts, feelings that are coming up for people. I also want to flag that a lot of the discussion has assumed some basic knowledge around Lacan and Lacan's orientation to the Oedipus complex, and that I want to encourage people, and in my small group, it was almost everyone who come from other theoretical, analytic, or political traditions, to feel encouraged to ask very basic questions, if you'd like, about what Daniel means, but as well as any other things that people want to share.
I might say something about your question about trauma, Daniel. I think it's a good one because a lot of these ways that we are conditioned to act happen when we're young. And Freud called it a compulsion to repeat. And he seemed to say that by repeating some of these tragedies that we experience, we can learn from them. And I see it a lot as a therapist where, excuse me, where somebody who's been traumatized sort of ends up re-experiencing the trauma in different forms over their life. And it seems that it sort of sets in motion perhaps like almost like a biological chain of reactions. So like the fight or flight system, for example, is sort of breached in some ways, where then that becomes the tendency to act later. So whether or not it's a victim or a perpetrator, and I think there's some evidence there that I'm not quite clear on, where if you do experience early life trauma, you sort of over-identify with either the victim or the perpetrator if you witness sort of trauma. And witnessing trauma is sort of worse than experiencing it for a child, I've come to understand. So I think there is some, maybe a biological, emotional trajectory that sort of tends to be put into play when the child is overwhelmed by circumstance.
Yeah, I mean, I had a debate with the scholar Catherine Liu on my program, and this kind of links back to the ethical dimensions of this thinking of how Freudianism can promote a type of or exacerbate problems with comrades, in the sense that, yeah, you know, I think that Lacan's point about this pragmatic aspect of Oedipus as one form of subjectivization, which is no longer the dominant one per se, can lead us to a form of politics in which we must resurrect it and bring it back as the dominant one, right? Because then that will allow us to work through it more adequately. And so I'm always wondering how we work with these insights precisely as insights, in a sense, like as without trying to force them in some ways, right? And I think that requires a certain attentiveness, which is important, you know. So that's kind of the heart of my thing. But as it pertains to trauma, I need to think more about that. I think it's useful, right? I think it's a useful way of kind of coming at this issue. But I don't know if I have a clear answer for you on that. It's definitely something I want to look at further, for sure. Yeah, I'd love to hear from others who are not as kind of centered in Lacanian orientation to these questions, how these frameworks sit with you. That would be interesting to hear from folks.
I recently had a long processing email exchange with a participant in our group and had to assert repeatedly that actually it's a very small minority of the people here who are diehard Lacanians, and that both amongst the organizers and amongst the facilitators and amongst the participants, actually a significant majority are not. And we sometimes lose sight of that in some discussions, I think because Lacanians like to talk.
Very interesting point. Yes,
Yeah.
And you're very right.
It's certainly not on you, Daniel. It's on everybody. Okay, Kat.
Hello. This is maybe more of a like a slightly more playful question, Daniel. But I just wondered. I'm new to the book, and I know that chapter 9, the political stakes of the superego, the social superego. Sorry. I just was curious about the fact that at the end of that chapter, your I may be wrong about this, but your primary cultural kind of case study for thinking about the non-subject is the Joker, the film The Joker. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about why that was. I hate the film, but yeah, also just was curious, you know, hence the being playful, but not as a, but in seriousness, not as a justification, but I guess it's a two-part question. One, whether you felt that was a really clearly emblematic case study for what you're working through or continuing to work through in relation to questions about the non-subject, or yeah, Freud's theorization of a distinct non-subject within the framework you're working with and invoking there. And also, second part, I guess, is whether or not there were any other kind of examples or cultural reference points that you thought about writing with or through at that time, or have thought about since completing that chapter, or that you're kind of ruminating, I guess,